Hey folks, this is Rhykker, and we just had today the Diablo 4 dev Campfire chat in which they responded to what some are claiming to be the worst patch in the history of action RPGs. During this live stream, we got a lot of acknowledgements of problems that players have been highlighting about this patch. We also got a number of promises of things that they're going to do to improve many of these things. But I was left with one fundamental question unanswered. In this video, I'll give a summary of this dev talk, give my thoughts and opinions on what's going on and what's being promised, and express what my biggest issue with this stream was. But before I move on, a quick word from this video's sponsor, which is something really exciting. Skytech Gaming, Intel, and Signal RGB have come together to create this Diablo 4 inspired PC, and it's freaking incredible. I couldn't even believe this was a computer at first. The health and mana potions have a swirling effect to them, and they actually react dynamically to your health and resource status in real time. Yes, as you take damage and your health drops in your health globe, it's also going to drop in the mana potion on your computer. And this is thanks to the Signal RGB app, which syncs RGB devices from any brand to bring you this cohesive lighting experience. And it doesn't just look beautiful, the Skytech team designed and 3D printed this custom PC with performance and cooling in mind. And it's a powerhouse of a unit. The hand-painted chest has inside of it a 13th gen Intel 13600K and an RTX 4070, so you can max out D4 at full graphics and get glorious FPS. Oh, and they're not just showboating about this. You can win this system. Just click the link in the description below for a chance to win this beauty. Seriously, I'm jealous of whoever wins this. Alright, diving into the chat itself, it involved Game Director Joe Shelley and Associate Game Director Joe Pipora basically reacting and responding to the incredible amount of backlash that we've seen. Honestly, I don't think I've seen the Diablo community this upset since Diablo Immortal. Not as bad as Immortal, but this is probably the second most upset I've ever seen the Diablo community. For those who need to be caught up, we got a patch earlier this week prior to Season 1. I have the patch note breakdown over here that, in short, nerfed everyone and everything. Everyone's doing less damage, and everyone is a lot squishier. The patch did a lot more than just that, but that's what the major complaints revolve around. So the stream opened with the devs acknowledging that. Acknowledging that people feel like it's a bad patch, acknowledging that it just feels bad to be weaker, and ultimately the most important thing, that it is less fun. And they stated multiple times that they never plan to do a patch like this ever again. They said they know that reducing player power is never a good experience in general. And they felt part of the issue as well was not effectively communicating to the community ahead of time and I guess blindsiding us with this giant nerf out of nowhere. But they want to give a little bit more insight into why some of the decisions that were made. On the topic of why they nerfed the amount of cooldown that you can get on your gear, they expressed that cooldown is basically one of the most important stats, if not the most important stat you can get in Diablo 4. And my own opinion here, when you design skills with cooldowns, right? When you decide my game is going to have cooldowns and you give different skills cooldowns, well, that's because you believe that skill is too powerful to be used all the time. So you're limiting how often that skill can be used. And if you then give players a way to reduce how often you have to wait for that to the point that you could make it have unlimited uptime, and then you're getting unlimited uptime on things like Unstoppable, and unlimited uptime on immunity or whatever it may be. It almost feels like these two design philosophies are at odds with each other, having cooldown and having cooldown reduction. So it becomes this very difficult balancing game of, okay, we design a skill to have this amount of downtime, but we're going to allow players to build up this amount of cooldown reduction. So the real amount of time we want, players to have this skill with uptime would be, maybe half or whatever you decide. You come up with some figure and you balance around that. But anyway, the devs were saying that because of the cooldown reduction in the game, a lot of these cooldown powers become very, very, very powerful, especially when you can have near 100% uptime on them, so much so that it dwarfs the effectiveness of other skills, other options, other builds. And what they always want is for you to have a variety of options, not just, well, you have to take these skills and get all this cooldown because you're just so powerful that way. And they feel that the current build meta that has emerged has to do with Nightmare dungeons currently being overtuned relative to what they intended, i.e. being too difficult. Therefore, you feel like, well, I need to get all these cooldown powers to be able to be unstoppable all the time, to break all the crowd control, to have these immunity effects, that you need to bring in these often cooldown related utility skills as part of your build. They feel that tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons are excruciatingly difficult for most players, and therefore you have to be funneled into these very small selections of builds that can tackle that content. And apparently that was never their intent, so they are actually planning on implementing a change where they're going to nerf the difficulty of Nightmare Dungeons. So they're going to make Nightmare Dungeon tier 100 as challenging as roughly what the current Nightmare Dungeon tier 70 is. But they do still want there to be chase content, pinnacle content for people to do, so they're planning to add another form of endgame. This is a more long-term plan, whereas the nerf to difficulty is going to be more immediate. They want to eventually add in more stuff for you to chase as very difficult things to test your build against, but not Nightmare Dungeons. They also acknowledge that Sorcerer was the class that was probably hit the worst by these changes. Again, in my video I highlighted why Sorc got it the worst. What we saw with Sorc was that a few cold builds were overperforming. Well, overperforming. They were performing very strongly, overperforming relative to other Sorc builds, but not really overperforming in the grand scheme of all the meta builds across all classes. And so they wanted to bring down those overperforming builds, which actually was because of a bug. So they fixed that bug, bringing down the power of the Sorc to make kind of all their builds more in line with each other, and they wanted that to be the baseline, so that they can then buff the Sorc up from there uniformly. But what happened is, well, we just nerfed this, and now it's just all down here, and it hasn't been brought up enough. And they stress that their intent is not to nerf the fun out of the game. They always want the game to be fun. They want you to have many options because they feel it's more fun if you have more viable options rather than just, well, this is the best thing, so you have to take it. But they conceded that they should take account of how players will feel about certain balance decisions and always ensure that players will have fun in the end and not feel like the fun has been removed. They spoke about vulnerable damage. They said that vulnerable damage they feel is just too important right now. Patch 1.1 saw a big nerf to vulnerable damage, which, because it's so important, effectively meant everyone lost a huge chunk of damage because everyone built for vulnerable damage since it was such a significant portion of damage, because players have a very solid understanding of damage bucket theory or damage deck theory and how damage is calculated, and they admitted that the problem is because vulnerable is a multiplicative source of damage. So they said they want to bring the power of vulnerable back in line, and it sounds like their plan is to make vulnerable another additive source of damage, which honestly makes sense. Why would it be any different from, damage to crowd-controlled enemies, damage to vulnerable enemies? Logically, you'd think it would also be another additive source of damage. The thing is, this is going to be a longer-term change because there's so many systems that interact with vulnerable damage. Overpower damage, crit damage, etc. They need time to ensure that this is going to be balanced properly without just killing a bunch of stuff. But they acknowledge that overall, the patch 1.1 was disruptive to the way people have been playing the game. They've been hearing the feedback, and they do plan to change how they do things moving forward. Now, at the very least, I would have expected that whenever you do a significant balance change, a significant nerf especially, give people a free respec. If now your build isn't working and you're a high-level character, I mean, it's very expensive to respec, and now, because of level scaling, it's hard to farm up things again because your build's not working anymore. I personally think it's a good idea. Again, every time you have a major balance patch, give that free respec. We see that in other games. Basically, the devs feel currently that vulnerable is a must-take stat, and that the game will be in a better balance state when it won't be. And I agree with this. So to clarify here, my position for years before D4 ever released, I have always been in favor of nerfs. I have always and will continue to be in favor of balancing, and you can go look at my old videos of what I wanted Diablo 4 to be before Diablo 4 was even revealed, that they need to balance every season, every patch, Diablo 4 with buffs and nerfs. The key there, though, is buffs and nerfs. Not just nerfs, and not just buffs either. Because if you only balance via buffs, which I know a lot of people are going to advocate for, you get Diablo 3, where we have items that give you plus 40,000% increased damage, and that's just ridiculous. And there's a number, you get increasing power creep, where we have 20 different difficulty modes in Diablo 3, because power creep, it just obsoletes all the content, and so you have to artificially add a just ridiculous number of extra difficulties that don't do anything meaningful other than dial up the hit points and the damage on the monsters, and the game effectively just becomes cookie clicker, where it's just about make number go big. But again, the key there, buffs and nerfs. So I do believe vulnerable absolutely was a problem, was way overperforming. I think crit damage as well. Even before Diablo 4 released, I did not want crit damage as an affix in the game. The concept of critting, great idea. You can make mechanics around critical hits, but I did not want to see crit damage as an affix because you combine crit chance and crit damage and it just becomes way too powerful, and it's so difficult to successfully balance both of those, and again, we're now in this position. Similarly, I've seen people advocate just remove vulnerable altogether. Vulnerable is a really cool mechanic. You do something to make an enemy take more damage. But again, maybe the solution there is we just don't give us the ability to increase vulnerable damage, so that we're not building so heavily around stacking damage modifiers to this condition. One way I've explained this balance patch is that it's basically like taking our medicine. This patch was necessary to improve upon some of the core aspects of the game to bring it into a healthier state. However, medicine goes down best when you pair it with something sweet. And in this case, the medicine just tasted horrible. And that became something the devs effectively spoke about during the Campfire chat, where they said when they're gonna nerf something, they're pledging to not nerf something unless they're gonna buff something else to compensate. They said that if they're gonna take a toy away from us, they want to give us other toys that are gonna be equally exciting. Basically, they're gonna allow things to continue to be overpowered, as long as it's not through an exploit or something broken. They'll allow things to continue to be overpowered until they can give us some alternatives, rather than just nerf it and then the fun is gone and there's nothing else for us to play with. They showed this slide here where they explained that their goal for the game, or their goals, they want to have a wide variety of viable builds to discover, put together and optimize across all 5 classes. And again, this can only be achieved if you're also nerfing the things that are overperforming. If you're going to buff the 20 things that are underperforming up in line with the overperforming thing, that is going to get to power creep and power creep and power creep, and in 5 years we're doing 40,000% damage. Next, they want new items and powers every season to keep the game fresh and increase build variety. Third, they want to be continually evolving endgame content with high monster density for powerful builds to mow down and activities to challenge your build. And I think that's also one main issue with what happened with this patch, was it was effectively just a nerf patch, but there was no new endgame content. There was a lot of stuff that people were hoping for out of Season 1 we didn't get, so the season was a little underwhelming, and then we're hit with these massive nerfs. And the fourth point, they want to make the game more fun for players. And again, most people feel that this patch made the game less fun. That's the thing about nerfs, they never make the game more fun. That's why you always have to have the sweet to go with the medicine. Again, even if it was like quality of life things, even if it was more stash tabs, these are all things that could have been paired with that sour taste to help this go down better. They also showed us this slide here with these 3 points. When making changes to increase build diversity, let some builds be overpowered until we have provided compelling alternatives. We discussed that before. These meta changes will occur at predictable times like the start of a season. They've previously expressed that they're not going to continuously nerf builds throughout a season. We saw that when Diablo 4 first launched because it was just the launch, but they don't want to continue with that. Nerfs might happen at the start of a season, but then it's not going to be like 2 months into the season, you're going to still be seeing nerfs. So any balance adjustments in that regard, we can expect to see only at the beginning of a season, so you can trust, okay, I can continue to invest in this build. The build that I've been having fun with for a month isn't going to suddenly disappear, and now I don't know if I want to keep playing season. But point 3, in situations where a bug is causing game-breaking damage or crashes, will still react quickly. Now, the only issue with this is that a player doesn't know, in general, outside of very obvious circumstances, a player often doesn't realize, oh, this is so powerful because of a bug. When things are double dipping, for instance, sure, the absolute blasting theory crafters can do the math, and they will do the math, and they'll see, why is this doing double damage? Oh, okay, I figured out, XYZ, insert complex math meme. But the average player who maybe is using something and they're like, hey, I found a really good combination, they're not realizing it's because of double dipping or some kind of exploit or bug. And so for them, it doesn't really feel any different to have something nerfed because it's a bug or just because it's too strong. And the devs even admitted that ARPGs are a power fantasy, that it's about giving us these tools, these toys to play with, and just kind of encouraging us to break the game. Not in a bad way, but just, have fun, find something we didn't think of, go crazy, feel super strong, and they don't want to make players feel punished for finding these best combinations. And so again, I bring it back to, okay, I understand that you gotta do this, right? As an advocate of nerfs, right? Let me clarify. I don't feel good when I get nerfed, right? In the same way that, I don't enjoy exercising per se, or I don't enjoy taking medicine, but I understand that it's good for me. So I understand a nerf is going to be good for the long-term health of the game, even though it hurts my immediate fun and I'm sour about it. But it's about the sweetness, or at least if you have to react quickly, then compensating for it later. Generally, when something is overperforming, it's overperforming at the highest tiers of play. That's where it's really broken. You know, Uber Lilith, what have you. That's where the exploit or the broken interaction really becomes prevalent and evident to the devs, right? It's not going to be your average gamer who is doing a Nightmare Dungeon 20 suddenly a lot better because they've happened upon some accidental exploit. It's only when the streamers and the blasters are obliterating Uber Lilith in 2 minutes that they realize, oh, well, that shouldn't be happening. But then when they nerf it or fix the bug, it does affect the average player as well. So in a case where you have to react rapidly to stop something insane from happening because of a bug, if that build was around for long enough, right, if it's just a 2-day thing, whatever, but if that build was around long enough for players to adopt the playstyle and enjoy it, maybe find a way to bring it in reasonably in the future. I am to this day still butthurt over Diablo 3's Bone Storm build getting nerfed. It was not overperforming. Okay, Diablo 3, there was a Bone Storm build Necromancer that, due to a bugged interaction of a legendary gem double dipping damage, it was a viable Necromancer build. The average player didn't know that it was double dipping. The average player didn't know why it felt strong. But again, it wasn't even an overperforming build, but because the devs saw that, oh, well, this is double dipping and it shouldn't be, they fixed that bug and that killed the build. And they never brought it back in any way. So all this to say, it's difficult to not feel like you're being punished if that thing just disappears, if it's just killed. And the team also acknowledged that the reaction to the patch probably would have been better if we had known, if we had those patch notes a week in advance, so we had more time to digest and sit on them, rather than just being sprung on us suddenly. This is true, and I'll take it a step further to say that if there was a PTR, it would help even more. So PTR in Diablo 3 is a test server where they would let us effectively beta test any patch for minimum a couple weeks before it launched. There's downsides to having PTR. That means the game is already solved before the season starts, right? So if that's the reason that they don't want to have PTRs, that they want to keep the excitement for the season, I can understand that, but there's obviously the downsides as well where, well, you don't get that round of feedback to make things perfect for launch or improve them in any way. It could also be just that their development pipeline now is such that they can't even do the PTRs anymore. In any case, they are now committed to giving us the patch notes at least 1 week before patch launch. And speaking of, they said that next Friday the 28th, they're going to do another dev stream because they have patch 1.1.1 to discuss, which is going to address a number of issues that players have been complaining about. They're taking a hard look at Sorcerer and Barbarian aspects that are underutilized, with a particular focus on the Sorc. So we can expect within about a week and a half, 2 weeks, to see significant improvements, well, hopefully, come to the Sorcerer. Also, change to Nightmare Dungeons coming in a hotfix later today. They're substantially increasing the monster density in Nightmare Dungeons. They're also going to be increasing the monster density in areas of Helltide where monster density is lower. So overall, this is a positive. It means more efficient farming. You know, more monsters to kill, you're getting more XP faster, you're getting more drops faster. And they said that these will be substantial increases. Now, they acknowledged players' inventory concerns. They reminded us that Season 2 is when they're targeting the changes to gems to not take up stash space. In patch 1.1.1, we're going to get one additional stash tab. Hey, it's better than nothing. So that, again, should be in maybe a week and a half. They didn't commit to a timeline, but it'll be shortly after the talk next Friday. If I had to guess, patch 1.1.1 will release on the Tuesday after the patch, which I believe is August 3rd. Tuesday tends to be a patch day for Blizzard. They're also going to change the max stack size for elixirs, bringing that up to 99. On the topic of respecs, they're going to be decreasing the cost of respecs by about 40% across the board. Again, that's going to be in patch 1.1.1. They also spoke about how long it takes to level, and they expressed that their intent was not to make the game take longer, They're not trying to slow down the game. And in fact, they're going to try to find ways to make the 50 to 100 experience take less time. They're going to adjust the XP curve. And this is because they realize that it's taking longer for people to reach 100 than they expected. They acknowledge that there's a brick wall that players hit in progress around level 75. But on the topic of why they nerfed power leveling, it's because in the interest of the game's fun. They don't want a game where one player sits at the entrance doing nothing, not having fun, while the other player is off killing everything, having fun. Overall, they want reaching level 100 to feel like an achievement, but not like a job. The devs then took a bunch of questions from chat. Throughout this, we learned that they're aiming for Season 3 for leaderboards, but they're probably not going to add it to an existing piece of content like Nightmare Dungeons. They want to build up an entire endgame system to go with leaderboards. Something that's tailor-made for that type of competition. On the topic of Uber uniques, right? We know currently there's a half dozen super rare items, and a question effectively called out how these items virtually don't exist for the majority of the player base, which is true. They're so exceptionally rare that you might as well pretend they don't exist. And the devs said that they're probably going to make these items a little bit more common in the future, be it through changing drop rates or otherwise content that allows you to get them more easily, but they still want them to remain exceedingly rare. They want them to be in a design space where players shouldn't expect to get these items. You should want them, but not take for granted that you will get them. And they don't want these items to feel mandatory to any build. And I fully agree with this philosophy. Again, this is one of those other things that I've been saying years before D4 ever launched. I want there to be god drops. Though I do agree that the current drop rates are probably a little bit too low, but I figured that's because, well, this is the launch state of the game. If they're too easy to get now, and we're going to get power creep, and we're going to get more tools to find them in the future, they eventually might become too common, but yeah, probably a bit too rare right now. The devs also addressed a question about crowd control, which has been a big topic in the community from before the patch, and they effectively admitted that they feel that at high levels of play, when there's a lot of monsters on screen, the current tools that we have to fight crowd control are inadequate, and they're looking at ways to improve that. My personal thoughts here, a common complaint from the community is that there's too much crowd control in the game, and I don't feel this way. I feel the problem is not too much crowd control, I feel the problem is too much chain crowd control. If you get CC'd, if you get hard crowd control, like a freeze, that sucks, but you have tools to deal with it. But when you get chain hard CC'd, you get frozen, and then you instantly get frozen again, and instantly frozen again, that is a horrible feeling. That's the problem, in my mind. So a very simple solution, which I'm not saying is the best, would be that after you get hard crowd controlled, you can't get hard crowd controlled again for 2 seconds. It gives you time to reposition, maneuver around, do something, have some agency about the situation. But it sounds like the devs are looking on a more robust solution that involves more tools or better tools for us to be able to deal with all the crowd control. The topic of loadouts was brought up. Apparently it's something that the user interface team is excited about, but there's no ETA on if and when they might bring in such a feature. The devs also acknowledge that there's just not enough stuff to do in World Tier 3 and 4, that they want there to be more things to engage with, more things in the journey, in the process of leveling up throughout World Tiers 3 and 4. And they have ideas for that for Season 2. The devs mentioned loot filters and how the UI team is working on ways to better be able to compare to see if an item is an upgrade. For Season 2, they have some plans on ways that you can target farm specific uniques, and they're exploring ways you can do something similar for legendary aspects. They also said that there will be more than just one patch before Season 2. Patch 1.1.1 is just the first patch. They admitted that with regards to survivability, Sorks were hurt the most by the patch earlier this week. They're going to talk more next week about patch 1.1.1 and how that's going to hopefully address some of the issues. But they spoke about as well how there's a number of ways right now that players are dying in a cheap way, a number of outliers of things that are basically one-shotting players, and they're looking at addressing that. Be it certain enemies, certain Nightmare Dungeon affixes, chill effects. They don't want the game to feel easy, but they want you to feel like you could do something to avoid dying, and they want to reduce the amount of cheap or unfair deaths. They're exploring different ideas about the Codex of Power, perhaps. They recognize that players are having to store way too many aspects in their inventory. Nothing really more to discuss there yet. They're currently targeting Season 2 for their revamp of Resistances. This is another far-reaching system like Vulnerable, where it's not just as simple as tuning up numbers, because it hits upon so many different aspects of the game. For anyone unaware, Resistances currently are underperforming as a form of defense relative to armor, which is partially why Sorks are in such a bad place. and are hurt even more by the nerf to armor than other classes because their ability to access armor is so much more limited. The devs expressed that in the future we will be given more tools through which we can craft or modify the items we have. When asked about why Summoner Necro needs to use up a skill slot for the summons, they said that this is basically just the cost of the skill. That if you want to have summons, then that's going to take up a spot on your hotbar. Otherwise, it's just for free, and yeah, that's basically that. So it sounds like they're not going to budge on that. They did acknowledge, however, that summons have survivability issues. And they also said they're going to give us better loot tables for goblins, or more types of goblins in the future. So goblins will be more likely to drop legendaries, and they want to introduce more types of goblins, the way Diablo 3 has many different types of goblins. So overall, a lot of good stuff to take away from this, but this brings me back to my singular greatest issue, which is effectively a response to one of their major messages to how they closed the stream and how they opened it, mirroring how they opened it, which was, "We hear you loud and clear, and we will never do a patch like this again." And so that's great, but then why did you do it to begin with? And that's the question that I feel I came away from the stream without a real answer to. At the start, there was some granularity to tackling specific topics of why things needed to be changed, but there was a lot of like, okay, we acknowledge that you feel bad and that this feels bad. And so it almost feels like it's coming from a position of, we understand and we know, but did you just learn this now, or did you not predict that this would be the reaction? Or and that's what I have questions about. It's all right, you're not going to do it again, but why did it happen to begin with? And so I think I would like to see, moving forward, if ever there's some negative criticism to respond to, is sort of like, well, this is what we were thinking then, right? What was the thought process to how we got to the position we're in? This is what we thought then. We acknowledge that this is bad, and this is what we're going to do to change, right? So I think we skipped the first step, and we just jumped to the second. We acknowledge this is bad. This is what we're committing to the future, or this is what we've learned. But okay, but so what was the thinking originally? Even if it's something as simple as we didn't anticipate players finding this so unfun, or we didn't anticipate XYZ. It could even be, well, we knew this would be an issue, but we just didn't have time. We had to push the patch out. I mean, I don't know what they can and can't say, but I do feel like I'm still left with some questions here. It could have been something like, you know, we knew we had to nerf these systems, and the sooner we address these issues, rather than letting it fester, right, it's best to rip the band-aid off quickly, right? You make these changes earlier in the life of a game, because the longer you wait, the more it's going to hurt to make these big nerfs to vulnerable and all that. So we knew we had to act fast, and we just didn't have the dev time to buff all the other things to compensate for it. And I think just as a player base, if we could understand the devs thinking more, if we could understand why certain decisions, why certain things were decided to be done certain ways, we could better understand when other changes are made in the future. It gives us a better baseline framework of understanding of how to interpret the things that are happening in the game. But those were my thoughts on my takeaways from the chat. I encourage you folks to sound off in the comments with yours. What did you think of the chat? What do you think of the changes that are coming? What did you think of the patch after actually having experienced Season 1? Are you enjoying Season 1? Sound off in the comments. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykkers Raiders for more Diablo content.